There are two things involved in information leaks when the people who have access to the information legitimately had reason to be there. The first is whether the policies that were set up within the system actually constrain access to only what they really need to know. Now, one of the problems in both these cases is people did legitimately have access to most of this information. They didn't have permission to do with it what they did with it. So the system is set up in such a way that, if you look at what most of our protections involve, they involve preventing people who shouldn't be there getting into places where they can have access to things you don't want them to see. That's not the situation that would need to be protected against in this case. In this case, it was someone did legitimately have right to access this data, but they didn't have right to do anything with it along the lines of what they actually did. So policies need to be set up in such a way that people have access only to what they need, and there are ways of determining what they can do with the data once they have it. Well, the classic way that an employee can protect themselves is no different in digital space to the physical space. You very carefully vet the employees that you give access to sensitive information. There's nothing fundamentally different about the digital space once you are an employee and inside the system. So the first answer is obviously better vetting. Now, of course, these people were vetted probably to the highest standards that currently exist. So there's clearly a problem. The only other thing they can really do is, again, an employee is inside the system. You have to monitor their behavior when they're there. So you certainly could notice anomalous behavior. You could put systems in place, some of which are technical, and some of which are just people monitoring each other in a reasonable way. So that when you see something that just doesn't look right, it is queried. So it's a classic case of we're dealing with organizations whose basic purpose is to monitor other people. They perhaps need more closer internal monitoring to make sure that people are not doing things they shouldn't be. There's always a trade-off. The more effort you put in, the smaller your footprint can be. If somebody is truly concerned with not leaving any kind of internet footprint whatsoever, it's just about possible, but it would require a lot of effort. The question is whether the effort is justified by the return. I mean, for most people, they actually don't care too much about what's online, provided it's only accessible by people who have no criminal intent, for example. There's probably a point of diminishing returns for most people. So I don't think for most of us it would be worth the effort of going to complete anonymity. Because, it would mean you couldn't, for example, just use a Google search. You couldn't, for example, just log into sites the way you would naturally. You'd have to go through anonymizers. You'd have to go through redirectors. It's all possible. The technology is out there, but it would cost something. So I think the literal answer is it is very possible to do if you think it's worth the effort. For most of us, it's probably not worth the effort because actually many of us want Amazon and Google and everybody else to know something about us to make good suggestions. We don't want people to have unauthorized access to some of that information, but then ultimately knowing what you like to read or sort of the kind of groceries you buy is probably not sufficiently sensitive. You'd go to the effort of making sure nobody could find that. There are other things where you probably would. So like everything else in the internet, it's trade-off. You trade off effort for an anonymity. There's an enormous amount of raw data out in the cyber world. The agencies we're talking about have considerable computing resources, but it is probably impossible to completely analyze all of the data available in the entirety of the space. So what organizations can do is they can target parts of the problem quite well. So if we imagine the entire space is huge, they can partition that down in such a way that there are particular groups coming from particular areas with particular topics of interest. Those they could probably analyze quite thoroughly and quite well. So it's a matter of the way you apply the available resource to the problem at hand. Get it down to manageable chunks. So again, if people are worried about anybody anywhere ever typing a wrong phrase and so being targeted, very unlikely. The big sky theory in aviation, unless you're around an airport, the chance of running into another airplane are remarkably low. So you're not going to have plane accidents anywhere except around airports. It's sort of the same. If you focus on areas where there are groups of people who are likely to be targets, and by areas I mean topic areas as well as physical areas, then there's a good chance that you can almost exhaustively analyze the information that comes in that space. But if you take that as a fraction of all of the data available in the totality of cyberspace, it's probably quite small. So it requires intelligence in the classic sense rather than in the military sense to be able to work out where the best place to use your resources to get good results are. So I do believe they can get very good results in carefully targeted ways and reasonable results in much broader ways, but not the we know everything anywhere from anyone at any time. That's just not feasible.